Hey guys, welcome back to Stories from the Stead with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, and head alchemist at Birdseye, Indiana's own Old Homestead Distillery, Alan Bishop. So, this weekend, tomorrow in fact, I will be speaking at the Daisy Spring Mill Distillery at Spring Mill State Park for the Candlelight Tour. We've done this several years now, and it's something that we really enjoy doing. Huge crowd of people, usually 7,000 people or more come through that event. It is a great opportunity to talk about the history of Indiana distilling, and specifically about the Daisy Spring Mill Distillery, one of the most well-renowned distilleries of pre-Prohibition Indiana. Of course, it only operated up into the 1880s. It's a true frontier-style distillery, and always was. It was never really industrialized in any major way, but it was well known for making awesome quality products at the time that it operated, across multiple different owners. So I thought I'd take a moment here today to tell you a little bit about the history of the Daisy Spring Mill Distillery. Let me preface this by saying, in Indiana history, the 6 weeks of it that we are exposed to in school, we are not told the truth about what mills were to the local agricultural community. We are told that the mills were important because the settlers didn't have a way to grind their own corn. This was never the truth. The mill was always an agricultural service station, a way to bring specie or money into a community that did not have money. And the way that they operated was often on trade in the early days. The distillery was every bit as important as the mill, if not more important, because most of the settlers had their own grain grinding equipment, whether that be a simple stump mill operated by a horse or a mule, or a tread mill of some sort. Corn was not a problem to grind in decent quantities that you would use for your family. Flour, yes, was a little harder to come by, and maybe a little bit more important when it came to the mills and the ability to feed a local community. But what they really needed was money and medicine. As such, what would happen is a mill would start, and it would be in addition to a distillery. The distillery often was the moneymaker of the operation. The mills worked by basically operating off of trade. You would bring in your corn to be ground at the mill, and you could basically take your part of that back as cornmeal, or as pork that was fed from the slop from the distillery, or as potentially wheat, or more often alcohol. The distiller himself wouldn't actually need all that corn because he has his own corn. However, what he does want is liquor, because what he's going to do is start milling in the fall and distilling in the fall. He's going to put that liquor away into casks, not for maturation, but just to hold over the winter time. And he's going to wait for the spring floods to come through. He's then going to build a flatboat. And on that flatboat, he is going to add all the extra pork that he has produced from the stillage from the distillery, all of the extra wheat and or cornmeal that he's produced, and all the extra whiskey or brandy he's produced. He's then going to ride that flatboat down south and sell his wares along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers all the way down to New Orleans. And if he makes enough money, he'll buy a horse or a mule and come back up the Natchez Trace, or he might even decide to walk. It's led to a lot of pirate stories, a lot of murder stories, that sort of thing. Another little historical aside that you might find interesting, all those shotgun houses that you see along old river towns, all up and down the Ohio and up and down the Mississippi and down in New Orleans, most of those were flatboats. Flatboats didn't come back upriver. They were sold for scrap and oftentimes used to make those shotgun-style houses. So back to Daisy Spring Mill. Bearing in mind that in the early days of Indiana as a territory, it was realized pretty quickly that distilling and milling operations were going to be a big business. It was known that there were cave systems here and good limestone water and plenty of water power to operate mills and distilleries. As such, a real land bonanza opened up, specifically to upstate New Yorkers who were very interested in this idea of building custom mills and then selling them off, or restoring them and flipping them. This is how many of the distillers from New York ended up here in southern Indiana, including the famous Hugh Hamer, who actually could have and potentially was an indentured servant of a man named John Hammersley. There may be a familiar relationship there, we don't know for sure, but certainly Hugh Hamer ended up here and ended up at the old Clifty Distillery just north of Campbellsburg, Indiana, intimately connected to Daisy Spring Mill Distillery, because Hammersley sent him to find a good place to build a mill. Hammersley himself being a millwright was in this business of creating mills and distilleries and then flipping them to new people as he went. Sam Jackson acquired the land at Spring Mill as payment for his services in the War of 1812. He sold the property to the Bullitt family in 1819. The distillery was started in a small way around this time. We don't know for sure if it was Jackson or the Bullitts who actually started the distillery. In short order, neither the mill nor the distillery could keep up with production, and it was sold to the Montgomery brothers of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who were speculative buyers of properties on the western frontier. Again, back to this flipping of mills and distilleries. Basically, the brothers were absentee landlords that bought the property sight unseen. It's not even known if they ever visited the property, and spent a small fortune building the current 3-story mill that you see there. They hired John Hammersley of nearby Clifty Mill at what is now Camelsburg's Cave River Valley to be their miller and their millwright. As it turns out, Hammersley as well was as you can probably already tell, it's pretty hard to tell the story of the Daisy Spring Mill Distillery without also including the story of the Old Clifty Distillery, because they are so well intertwined. After Hammersley sends Hamer to southern Indiana to find a piece of property suitable for building a mill and distillery of large industrial scale for that time period in the 18-teens, they get the distillery and the mill online in 1820. Around 1825, 1826 or so, Hammersley decides that he's actually going to sell the Old Clifty Distillery and mill to his son. Now, Hamer was never an owner at Old Clifty, never owned anything there. He was simply an employee, a distiller, and a millwright. He was there at a time when this was wilderness. In fact, there is a story about how his wife was trapped in the old cabin there for multiple days as her husband had left the valley to go out on some business, and the wolves had moved in to live under the porch, and they were waiting for her. They would hide from her where she couldn't see them when she was in the cabin, and when she came out, they would come out and come after her. This was rough times in the western frontier, for sure. Nonetheless, the relationship between Hamer and Hammersley has not been very well researched, in my opinion. Not well researched enough. We don't know if there was an indentured servitude there, or if there was some familiar relation, or how that whole thing played out over the years. But you can imagine in 1825, when Hammersley decided to sell the Old Clifty Distillery to his son and move elsewhere to Bono to build another mill and distillery, which he would also flip. He did this multiple times in his life, that there were probably some hurt feelings. Hamer himself and his brother didn't have much money. The story is, from oral legend, that he left the the Old Clifty Distillery with nothing but the clothes on his back, an ox cart, an ox, and the old still that ended up at the Daisy Spring Mill Distillery. We'll talk a little bit more about that still in a little while. Nonetheless, once he gets to the distillery and milling operation at the Daisy Spring Mill Distillery, it doesn't take long for rumors of a crack in the foundation of the mill to make their way back to the brothers who own the mill. It was said that this crack would be disastrous. It was going to destroy the mill. The crack is still visible. It's still there today, and it never hurt the mill, not one bit. But the brothers, being speculative owners of multiple things throughout the new frontier, basically let the mill go to Hamer for $7,000 to be made on payments, which is nothing. So, around this same time period, the distillery was expanded. A distiller was hired full-time. The first distiller was there about 10 years. Thereafter, around 1845 or so, a man named William Dalton, a local man, became the distiller for the Daisy Spring Mill Distillery. He would spend the rest of his career there, being the longest tenured Indiana distiller that we know of at 45 years in the industry at the same distillery, making the good old peach brandy, the good old grape brandy, the good old apple brandy, and the famous, quote-unquote, Old Hamer whiskey. We should touch on that for just a moment. Old Hamer whiskey was not really a brand. It was never referenced on a barrel head or anything of that nature. It was never bottled as Old Hamer whiskey. It's simply what it was called locally. It never was the brand that was sold there. I have seen the barrel brand from that distillery. It simply says Copper Distilled on it. Nothing more, nothing less. It is what it is. But the story is romantic nonetheless. So Hamer operated the mill in the village and the distillery until his death in 1872. In the 1840s, the railroad had bypassed this area. Unfortunate for the little village, because Mitchell now became the focus of all the local traffic. The village started to die off to some degree. For many years, Hamer had hoped to have the railroad to build a spur line to the old Daisy Spring Mill site, such that they could sell their limestone for building materials and export it, and potentially make a good amount of money doing as such. Unfortunately, this was never to happen. As well, the mill was starting to die off because the railroad had chosen Mitchell to sort of be the place that the railroad business would happen at in the local community, and the local community no longer needed the mill for their flour and their various things that mills could provide at that point in time. However, the whiskey and the brandy remained incredibly popular. In 1872, Hugh Hamer dies, but that's not the end of the story for Daisy Spring Mill Distillery or the mill itself, as it was sold to two local prominent businessmen, Solomon Scott and Jonathan Turley. Now, Mr. Turley has had more than enough written about him that I won't go into great detail about him here. However, Solomon Scott is an interesting character of whom not a lot is said in Indiana history. Mr. Scott was the owner of several local saloons and taverns. He also owned the Solomon Scott and McCoy Distillery near Apple Acres in modern-day Bedford/Mitchell, Indiana. He had been married into two other prominent distilling families, the McCoys as well as the Wolfs in Stampers Creek Township, Orange County, Indiana, himself living in Paoli Township right next door to them. His wife was actually a McCoy. These families did tend to stay pretty close to one another. Nonetheless, at this point in time, the local Daisy Spring Mill Distillery, as it was called at that time, became incredibly popular for its apple brandy, maybe second only to the Old Clifty apple brandy made by Henry Robertson just up the road. Of course, again, an incestuous relationship to some degree between those two locations in particular. Nonetheless, the distillery operated up until 1886, April 18th to be exact, when the last batch of apple brandy was ran there and the distillery was closed permanently. Well, at least legally closed permanently. About a year before this, Solomon Scott got out of the business. He dropped his ownership in both distilleries, telling his family that he was tired of the federal government making more off of his work than what he did. But he immediately entered into the illicit distillation business, where he remained until 1910, operating out of a building next to his house in Paoli, Indiana. His son Howard and his daughter Belle took over this business whenever Prohibition came along, and slightly before Prohibition even, providing local rock and rye, that is rye whiskey with rock candy in it, to people who were suffering from the Spanish flu that the doctors would not go and visit themselves. A lot of families in that region still credit their survival to this day to Howard and Belle Scott. They were busted for running the house illicitly as a tavern during Prohibition, and the story goes that when Belle was put on trial, after the judge had read off all the charges against her, she simply stood up in court and said, "Judge, you should know you bought most of it." Going back to the Daisy Spring Mill Distillery and that illicit distilling that I mentioned, the little town was slowly enveloped by the undergrowth of southern Indiana and sort of disappeared into the weeds. And it wasn't until the Conservation Corps and the state of Indiana was able to acquire the land and start the restoration project. It's my understanding that there were still some families living around that old distillery, and they were using it to make some illicit moonshine at the time. They were actually still using the original still, and let's jump back to that old still real quick. So that still is interesting. The Daisy Spring Mill Distillery is the most extant old distillery in the state of Indiana. As far as what equipment they have, it being the original building and original logs, even though it was reconstructed, fermenters on hand, the old mash tubs, the old boiling tub, all that stuff still there. Even a brand for the barrel heads is still there. But the still is the most interesting part. This still clearly dates somewhere between 1808 and 1812. It did come from the old Clifty Distillery. It was brought there by Hugh Hamer. But the most interesting part about it is the way that it's constructed. It is not made of sheets of copper. It is made of one solid sheet of copper for the body, and a separate sheet was presumably used for the head. The head is missing now. We do still have the worm tub for this still as well. But what makes this one piece still interesting is that that is indicative of a particular style of still building. The style of still building is that was derived from the Stanley Gypsies. Stanley Gypsies were actually stationed out of Dayton, Ohio. And what they would do is that in the spring of the year, they would leave Dayton, Ohio, come down to the banks of the north side of the Ohio River, and start to travel west along the Ohio River all the way down to St. Louis. They would cross over, go back up, going east on the Ohio River, getting back home in time for the wintertime. These guys were tin workers and copper workers, and they were damn good at what they did, and they liked to show it off in their construction skills. So as opposed to using panels of copper, they would take a solid sheet. they would cut a tree down and start to form the trunk of that tree to the shape of the still that they were building, burning it and chipping at it, etc., until they got it where they wanted. They would then take that sheet of copper and beat it to form to match that section of the tree trunk. After that was done, they would begin to burn the tree trunk out of the inside of the still, and at the same time, they would tin the inside of the still. Old stills were tinned on the inside so that they wouldn't pick up oils from botanical distillations and things of that nature, and they would wash much more clean. When they were finished with this, they added rivets to the still. The rivets are completely 100% non-functional. They are literally there as bragging rights in order to show people what kind of copper work that they could do. Now, this same band of Romas, what you might have called gypsies at that time, did end up in Indiana, and the very last queen of the gypsies is actually buried, I almost said planted, that's how dark I am, was actually buried at Evansville, Indiana. They do have modern day descendants. Somewhat disappointingly, you probably know these people as they're celebrities. They're the Kardashians. If these stories interest you, I'll have these and plenty more at the Spring Mill Candlelight Tour tomorrow evening at Daisy Spring Mill Distillery. From our hearts and hearts to yours, we love y'all. Later. Now, real quick before we go, something just occurred to me that I had not thought about previously to recording this video, and that's about how history doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. Interestingly enough, Spring Mill was a village of artisans and craftsmen, a community of sorts, an old homestead of sorts, and that's very much so what we are doing at Southern Indiana's old homestead distillery. Not only is there the lake and the marina, the gas station, the winery and the brewery, but there's the hotel and the distillery. We have created a modern day Spring Mill, a gathering point for community, a gathering point for arts and crafts and trades. That's pretty unique. That's something I'm very proud to be a part of. I had not noticed those echoes of history until just this moment. Love you guys.